What if everything we believed about Viking seamanship, every myth, every reconstruction, every confident line in a textbook has been quietly wrong? What if the true reason they survived the North Atlantic has nothing to do with fearlessness, brute strength, or luck, but with a form of knowledge so old, so precise, and so deeply rooted in human instinct that modern sailors barely recognize it anymore? I ask myself that question every time I stand along a northern shoreline, breathing the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, it moves straight into bone. Because the deeper I dig into what the Vikings left behind, the warped timbers, the burial ships sealed in frozen earth, the sagas whispered in half poetry and half warning, the more I feel something beneath the surface. A pattern, a missing layer, a secret never written down, yet always there, waiting in the silence between the waves. Think about it for a moment. How did people with no compass, no instruments, no metal hulls, and no charts survive the most violent ocean on Earth? How did they cross a horizon with no landmarks at all? A place where storms rise without mercy, where black waves can swallow entire crews, where even steel ships armed with radar and engines still vanish. The Vikings didn't survive the North Atlantic by resisting nature. They survived because they understood it physically, instinctively, through patterns burned into memory, and a harsh apprenticeship that began in childhood and never truly ended. And that leads us to the question beneath everything we know. Did the Vikings possess a form of environmental intelligence, an early, unwritten science so advanced that it allowed them to listen to an ocean that kills anyone who misunderstands it? Hold that question. Let it unsettle you. Because it will shadow every step we take from here, becoming sharper, louder, and harder to ignore the deeper we travel into their world. To understand the Vikings, you must first understand the world that created them. Not their kings, not their kingdoms, not the artifacts displayed beneath museum lights, but the environment itself. A landscape that shaped their instincts long before their ships reshaped history. Northern Europe in the early medieval age was unforgiving. It was carved by ancient ice, hammered by storms rolling in from the Atlantic, and ruled by a cold so deep it could decide who lived and who didn't. Glacier-cut fjords split the land like wounds. Rocky beaches offered no softness, only wind, salt, and stone. And above everything, stretched a sky that shifted moods with dangerous speed. Children here didn't study the ocean from books. They learned it the moment they stepped outside. They learned it in the bite of winter air, in the sting of salt carried on the wind, in the way clouds thickened hours before a storm announced itself. Their education wasn't verbal. It was sensory. It was survival. Imagine being 5 years old and already knowing how to feel the weight of air on your skin, how to read the color of distant water like a warning, how to hear an approaching gale and the restless calls of gulls. Imagine growing up where the ocean is never far away, always visible, always loud, always reminding you that one mistake can erase you. This was their classroom. This was their science. Long before a longship ever touched the sea, Viking seamanship had begun, forged through childhood spent inside the rhythm of a violent world. By the time they were old enough to sail, the ocean wasn't a mystery. It was a language they had been absorbing their entire lives. And in a world where the line between survival and extinction was razor thin, those who learned that language lived. Those who failed left nothing behind. If you want to understand why Viking seamanship feels almost supernatural today, you need to look at where their earliest memories were formed. Tidal flats that breathed with the moon, cold surf that numbed the skin, and fjords that echoed with winds capable of changing direction in seconds. In places like these, even the smallest detail mattered. The tilt of a cloud's shadow, the scent of wet stone drifting inland, the pattern of ripples at a fjord's mouth. None of this was poetry. None of it was myth. These were data points in a world with no instruments, clues in an environment that punished the smallest mistake. By the age of 10, Viking children could already do things that astonish us today. Read distant swells with their naked eyes. Identify incoming weather by the way birds shifted their flight. Sense land through subtle changes in wave color. And gauge direction, simply by watching how the wind pressed against grass, sails, or even their own clothing. This wasn't mysticism. This was pattern recognition sharpened by necessity. Modern cognitive science calls it environmental encoding. The mind absorbing countless sensory cues, storing them silently, then retrieving them instantly when danger approaches. The Vikings didn't study the ocean from the outside. They grew inside it, because they learned these patterns before their minds were fully formed. The knowledge didn't stay in their memory. It sank into instinct. A Viking sailor didn't need to debate whether a storm was coming.
Yes, the wind
He felt it
shifts
tightening in the air, shifting in the hull beneath him, rising in the distant pitch of waves rolling toward shore. Their mastery of the sea didn't begin on the deck of a longship. It began in childhood, in the silence between gusts of wind, in the dull thunder of surf hammering cliffs, in winter nights spent listening to elders tell stories wrapped in navigational truths. To us, these tales sound mythical. To them, they were survival manuals disguised as folklore. And this is what fascinates me most. Long before brilliant engineering shaped the longship, the Vikings shaped themselves into people who could read a hostile planet with almost surgical clarity. This was the foundation. This was the seed of everything that would follow. And here inside the childhoods of a harsh northern world we catch our first glimpse of the real secret behind Viking seamanship. A secret we will unravel further as this journey continues. Before I ever stepped onto a reconstructed Viking ship, I assumed their design was exaggerated, some romantic symbol of northern craftsmanship. But the moment my boots touched those ancient-shaped planks, everything changed. I understood instantly why these vessels redrew the map of the world. They were not crude. They were not primitive. They were alive, responsive, flexible, almost aware of the sea beneath them. Run your hand along a longship's hull and you feel something modern vessels have forgotten. Flexibility. These ships were built in the clinker style, overlapping planks fastened in a rhythm that echoed the waves they were meant to ride. No sharp angles. No rigid geometry. Every line curved, every board breathed, every joint allowed the ship to flex like a living ribcage. When the ocean struck a longship, it didn't crack. It yielded, bowing, bending, absorbing shock in ways steel plates cannot mimic. Modern engineers who have scanned these hulls with lasers admit something surprising. A clinker-built structure disperses energy through the entire vessel, turning impact into movement rather than destruction. And none of this was accidental. The Vikings refined this design through centuries of trial, failure, memory, and survival. One generation lived. The next copied what worked. Survival was the only blueprint. What shocked me most was the open deck. Medieval writers mocked it, and Victorian historians dismissed it as primitive. But stand on one in cold wind and you understand instantly. An open deck is a weapon. Air flows freely. Moisture evaporates before sickness can take hold. Bacteria have no dark corners to grow. In an age long before germ theory, the Vikings engineered through necessity a healthier ship than many enclosed vessels centuries later. There was no smoke to choke lungs. No stale warmth to feed mold. Everything stayed cold, clean, and swept constantly by fresh wind, exactly what the North Atlantic demanded. Standing there, on a deck built like a breathing creature, I realized something profound. A Viking ship wasn't built to fight the ocean. It was built to cooperate with it. And that philosophy, yielding without breaking, was the first real glimpse into the deeper intelligence behind their survival. We often picture Viking life as rugged, dirty, brutal. A world of smoke, mud, and unwashed warriors. But archaeology tells a different story. One that reveals a surprisingly advanced understanding of hygiene long before the word existed. Across excavation sites in Scandinavia and the British Isles, we uncover objects that rewrite the stereotype. Combs carved from polished antler, grooming knives tucked into leather cases, soap blocks made from animal fat and ash, wool clothing washed regularly in cold streams or salt water. This wasn't vanity. It was strategy, pure survival logic. On a longship, hygiene wasn't optional. It was armor. Moisture meant mold. Mold meant sickness. And sickness, in the middle of the North Atlantic, meant death. So the crew cleaned relentlessly. They scraped every tool dry. They aired bedding whenever they reached shore. They sealed planks with tar to keep dampness out. They treated cleanliness the same way modern sailors treat life jackets. And then came the most unintentionally brilliant adaptation of all. Fermented drinks. Ale, mead, liquids with natural microbial protection. Fresh water stored in wood went bad in days. But ale stayed safe, and mead stayed pure. Without knowing the word bacteria, the Vikings built a diet that defended them against it. Today, microbiologists finally understand why outbreaks devastated later European voyages, but rarely struck Viking crews. Their ships were cold, ventilated, sunlit, scoured constantly by brine and wind. A Viking longship wasn't just a vessel of wood and iron. It was a sanitation system, a moving ecosystem engineered, through instinct and necessity, to deny disease a place to live. The deeper I studied this, the clearer the pattern became. Their greatest technology wasn't forged in metal or born in warfare. It was adaptation. Quiet, practical, and generations deep. There is a moment almost spiritual when you watch a Viking ship glide over rising swells, and something inside you finally clicks. Only then do you begin to understand how they crossed oceans that intimidated, and often defeated, civilizations with far more technology. The Vikings didn't navigate by memorizing maps. They navigated by reading a living world. To them, the ocean was a layered tapestry of signals. The subtle bend of distant waves. The shifting angles of cloud shadows drifting across water. The looping flight of seabirds returning to land at dusk. The low-frequency pulse of swells born from storms hundreds of miles away. The faint freshening of seawater where unseen rivers met the sea. At night, they read the stars, with a devotion closer to ritual than technique. Seasonal constellations became chapters in an unwritten manual. And when clouds swallowed the sky, they relied on sunstones, crystals that polarized light to find the hidden sun glowing behind the storm. Oceanographers today speak of wave groups, wind lanes, long-period swells, patterns identified by satellites and instruments. The Vikings detected them with their bodies, with the soles of their feet pressed against oak planks, with palms resting lightly on the hull, feeling vibrations whisper up through the wood. Every wave carried a story. Every ripple signaled wind shifting beyond the horizon. Every distant sound hinted at underwater ridges or the shape of land just out of sight. Modern tests show that longships amplify underwater vibrations, turning the entire vessel into a sensory tool. So when a seasoned Viking felt a heavier pitch, a sluggish drift, or a vibration slightly off rhythm, they didn't panic. They understood. Somewhere ahead, the world had changed wind, current, depth, or coastline. This wasn't magic. It was empirical knowledge refined across generations, a scientific method without notebooks or laboratories. To outsiders, it looked like instinct. To the Vikings, it was literacy, a way of reading a world most people never learned to see. Modern sailors measure time in hours, instruments, rotations. Vikings measured time in pulses, in cycles, in the quiet breathing rhythm of a ship moving through cold water. Life aboard a longship followed sequences that almost never broke. Rowing in steady shifts, sleeping in brief rotations, eating small, practical meals, adjusting sails as a single body, falling into silence when the weather thickened. This rhythm wasn't militaristic. It was mathematical. A living equation designed to keep fatigue low, balance constant, and danger predictable. There was no wasted motion. No unnecessary noise. Even fire was banned, not just because it was risky, but because smoke soaked into wool and weakened lungs. Warm, enclosed spaces were avoided because warmth bred condensation, and condensation bred mold. Cold was safety. Simplicity was safety. Repetition was safety. Their food reflected the same logic. Hard bread, dried fish, smoked meats wrapped tightly for weeks at sea. No boiling pots that could spill. No flames that could jump. No rituals of comfort, only the rituals of survival. When I first studied their reconstructed routines, the truth became obvious. A Viking voyage was engineered like a biological system, a machine made of people and wood, built not for comfort but for endurance. Every habit reduced risk. Every rule preserved health. Every constraint kept the crew aligned in body and mind. And perhaps the most fascinating rule of all was silence. When storms approached, they stopped speaking not from fear, but because listening became essential. The ship creaked differently. The wind thickened. The sea changed tone. Sound itself turned into data. They didn't wait for danger to reveal itself. They heard it forming long before it arrived. This rhythm, this interplay of silence, movement, discipline, and awareness, was not just a way of life. It was a survival algorithm carved into their behavior, refined by generations who understood that the ocean rewards those who listen, and erases those who don't. There is a moment standing on the open deck of a longship when the sky suddenly feels more important than the sea beneath your feet. When you realize the Vikings were not just sailors, they were meteorologists, born centuries before meteorology existed. And unlike us, they never separated themselves from the weather. They lived inside it. I remember reading an early Icelandic text describing how a sailor felt the sky change. At first, I dismissed it as poetic exaggeration, but after months studying northern weather systems, I understood exactly what it meant. Pressure shifts are physical. You feel them on your skin, in your bones, in the strange stillness that settles across the wind. The Vikings recognized these subtle changes instantly. Their cloud literacy alone was astonishing. Iron-gray layers meant a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Pale gold skies signaled stability stretching westward. Thin violet streaks announced an easterly wind sharp enough to carry winter in its teeth. Today, meteorologists use satellites to see these patterns. The Vikings used their eyes trained across lifetimes. And it wasn't just what they observed. It was when they observed it. They understood, almost unnervingly well. The invisible corridors storms followed across the North Atlantic. The tracks modern climatologists call Icelandic lows. These systems move in repeating cycles, rising and falling like a breath. To scientists, they are data. To Viking sailors, they were fate. When I walk along old Norwegian harbors, I can picture the scenes clearly. Crews waiting days, sometimes weeks, watching the wind shift degree by degree. Watching clouds stretch thin across the sky. Watching the ocean fall into that eerie, glassy calm that comes just before a safe departure window. They weren't patient because they were timid. They were patient because timing meant the difference between a voyage remembered or a voyage mourned forever. And this discipline shaped every journey they undertook. The Vikings didn't challenge the weather. They negotiated with it, respecting the ancient terms set by a planet that never forgives arrogance. There is a moment, one that reveals the true genius of Viking seamanship, when the world turns violent. When the horizon disappears into a wall of gray. When the wind begins to scream. And when the sea rises in black towers no crew should ever survive. Somewhere inside a storm like that, you finally understand why the Vikings were feared. Not because they were reckless, but because they could operate calmly, intelligently in conditions that would break most humans. When the first sharp gust hit, they lowered their sails. Not a second too late. Not a heartbeat too early. Before the canvas could betray them. Before the wind could rip it from the yard. They turned the bow directly into the waves, refusing to let the ship be caught sideways and capsized. When the sea became too wild for wind to govern, they rowed. Not wildly, but in synchronized, almost meditative rhythm, holding the ship's orientation with muscle memory older than written language. And when the water climbed higher than the mast, they bailed. Bucket after bucket, minute after minute, hour after hour. Each movement part of a ritual that had saved generations before them. What struck me most was what they didn't do. They didn't scream. They didn't panic. They didn't try to overpower the storm. Because their ships were never built to fight the ocean. They were built to yield. To flex and roll beneath the weight of water instead of resisting it. A shallow draft let the hull rise with the swell instead of being swallowed by it. An open deck let the sea wash in and out without trapping the crew under collapsing wood. Modern simulations show that a longship could survive conditions that would tear apart heavier medieval vessels. But it wasn't the ship alone. It was the partnership, the choreography between human and craft. The Vikings didn't overpower the sea. They matched its rhythm. They obeyed its physics. And by doing so, they found a narrow doorway through the violence. A path almost no other civilization ever discovered. Stormcraft, to them, wasn't about courage. Stormcraft was comprehension. When I began this exploration, I was searching for a simple answer. Some forgotten tool, some hidden technique, some practical secret that explained how the Vikings survived the most dangerous ocean on Earth. A single detail that history had misplaced. But standing now at the end of this journey, after tracing their childhoods, their ships, their hygiene, their navigation, their mastery of weather, and even their psychology, I understand something far deeper. The Vikings did not survive the North Atlantic because they were fearless. Fearlessness alone would have drowned them. They survived because they paid attention. Attention to wood, how it swelled, how it flexed, how it breathed under pressure. Attention to wind, its tone, its temperature, its subtle shifts. Attention to water, to cold, to silence. Attention to each other, bound together by trust in a place where trust meant survival. Their science was not written in books. It lived in their bodies, in their instincts, in the quiet intelligence forged only after generations of listening to a world that punishes every mistake immediately. Today, we study them with tools they could never imagine. Instruments, drones, satellites, archaeological labs. Yet the truth that kept them alive is older, simpler, and somehow more profound than all of that. The ocean speaks. The Vikings learned to listen. And once you grasp that, you begin to see our modern world differently. We're surrounded by technology, insulated from weather, protected from risk. And in that comfort, we've forgotten how to hear the planet that carries us. But the echoes of Viking knowledge remain. In every northern swell, in every shifting wind pattern, in every cold pulse sweeping across the Atlantic. That ancient intelligence is still there, waiting for anyone willing to pay the same price the Vikings once paid. Humility, patience, and attention. So the question that opened this journey, how did they survive, finds its true ending here. They survived not by mastering nature, but by understanding it. And that understanding may be the oldest human technology we possess, and the one we most desperately need to remember. If you want to keep exploring the forgotten sciences of ancient worlds, if you believe our past still whispers truths we've stopped listening to, then stay with me here, on Dark Origins. Because out there across old fjords, through buried ship graves, beneath the waves of the North Atlantic, there are still stories waiting. Stories of how humans once survived, not by conquering nature, but by learning to move with it. And some of those stories may change how we face our own storms.